Hi guys, Rod from Bensonium Thought Videos here, and this week I am taking another break from my series on the philosophy behind the scientific method to focus on anti-vaccination propaganda, especially in relation to the Covid-19 vaccines. What has prompted me to make this video is watching a Channel 4 documentary on the disgraced medical charlatan Andrew Wakefield, who falsely claimed a causal link between autism and the triple MMR vaccine. Also, I saw another very long interview with a Dr Mike Yeadon, a former employee of Pfizer. The interview with Dr Yeadon was over an hour long, and during the interview, Yeadon made some incredible claims, including accusing all the scientists who have developed the COVID-19 vaccine of being involved in a mass crime of trying to harm the general public. So where do I begin? Well, firstly, from the outset, it should be recognised that the concept of vaccination is actually a little weird. The fact that purposely exposing yourself to part of a pathogen that normally makes you ill will not only cause you no harm, but in the future afford you protection from that pathogen is counterintuitive. The reason this works is down to the way our adaptive immune system operates. One can think of the immune system as producing millions and millions of antibody-producing cells, where each individual cell produces a different antibody that will bind a certain molecular shape. Now, when a foreign entity such as a virus enters your body, it takes a certain amount of time for the tiny subset of immune cells which have the right antibodies that combine the molecular structures on the virus, and these are called antigens, to replicate to large enough numbers where the immune cells can interfere with the viral program that is disrupting your body's cells. This lag time is what allows a potentially nasty virus to replicate rapidly inside infected cells and so cause disease. Once the immune system has been able to generate enough immune cells that have the right antibodies to bind the invading virus, viral cellular infection and replication are brought to a halt. And most of the time, you completely recover without any lasting negative long-term effects. Likewise, the rapid expansion of immune cells that contain antibodies that combine the virus also comes to a halt, because you no longer need such a large number of these cells once the virus is no longer present in your body. Yet the immune system also does something very clever. While the immune population of cells that was generated to fight the virus is now reduced, a subset of immune cells differentiate into what are called T memory cells that continue to circulate in your body for many years. These cells, if stimulated in the future by an antigen that binds their antibody, can rapidly replicate, resulting in a much quicker, stronger adaptive immune response than occurred when the virus entered your body the first time. This more rapid response gives the invading pathogen much less time to replicate before the immune response begins to clear it from your body, and so the viral load inside your body never becomes great enough to cause sickness. What this looks like from a non-molecular point of view is simply the observation that once you caught a certain illness, you are less likely to catch it a second time, or if you do catch it a second time, the symptoms of the second infection is much less severe than when you got it the first time. Now, viruses, like people, can be related to one another. In the Middle Ages, the virus smallpox was an incredibly deadly pathogen, killing about 30% of all people infected. However, smallpox was related to another virus called cowpox, which could be passed on from cows to humans. In 1768, the English physician John Fuster realized that a prior infection of cowpox made a person immune to smallpox. Jenner also realized that this applied to milkmaids who frequently contracted cowpox but not smallpox, and he postulated that the pus from cowpox blisters could be used to transfer whatever it was that made the milkmaids resistant to smallpox to other people. Jenner tested this hypothesis on May the 14th, 1796, when he inoculated James Phipps, an 8-year-old boy who was the son of Jenner's gardener, with the pus taken from the blister on a woman named Sarah Nelms, who was a milkmaid that caught cowpox from a cow called Blossom. It always amazes me how all these technical details are captured in the methods of a research paper. Even the cow's name has been preserved for us to know today. Anyway, Jenner infected Phipps in both arms with the pus, and Phipps became mildly ill with a fever but soon recovered. He then challenged the boy's immune system with pus from a smallpox victim, and Phipps developed no disease. Jenner repeated this procedure a further 23 times, and it became obvious that prior exposure to cowpox protected against catching smallpox. It was this critical observation that led to the birth of modern vaccination, and ultimately to the complete elimination of smallpox from the planet in the 1980s. Thus, the concept of vaccination is a very old and scientifically established method going back hundreds of years, and now rests on a solid foundation of experimental and theoretical immunology. Of course, we have come a long way from injecting live pathogens into people to try and stave off the worst disease with modern vaccines containing only the molecular components of a pathogen. These components do not cause disease, but do allow the immune system to be primed, so that if the vaccinated person then comes into contact with the real pathogen, their immune systems can mount a much more rapid response before the pathogen has time to cause its usual symptoms. Yet when Jenner first performed his groundbreaking experiments, people were extremely and understandably suspicious of his work, as this cartoon now shows. The idea that one could prevent a serious disease by giving somebody a lesser version of that disease seemed to many like medical quackery, and sadly this view of vaccination theory has not completely disappeared even in the 21st century. Now, in some ways, I guess it is psychologically understandable. For example, imagine you learned that the man your daughter was marrying was the brother of a convicted serial killer. I think most folk would at least be a little uneasy about the match, even though technically the brother's moral character is completely independent of his psychopathic sibling. The issue is we often assign similar characteristics to entities that are closely related to one another. So given a vaccine must, by its nature of priming the immune system, be related to whatever disease you are vaccinating against, in some people's minds this makes them suspicious that the vaccine itself will also cause harm. Secondly, this worry can be made worse also by the fact that any medical intervention X can be followed by negative outcome Y. This is one of the reasons we do double-blind placebo-controlled trials, because given a large enough population, events after the intervention are going to happen. The human brain is wired to pattern match, so we are overly tempted to conflate two events in close succession with causal connections. Wakefield has played this card powerfully in relation to the MMR vaccine and autism. As a father of a special needs autistic child, the time you become aware that your child's mental development is not proceeding normally is around the age when children receive the MMR vaccine. So how do we disentangle a correlation in time between two events with causation? Well, one way is to look at the control placebo group. Yet for mischievous snake oil salesmen who want you to distrust mainstream science, if you ignore the control data, the adverse event correlations with treatment interventions can be used powerfully against our natural instinct to pattern match, and so we draw false causation where there is none. Thirdly, the pathophysiology of COVID-19 is complicated, and the literature is now vast and rapidly increasing because obviously this pathogen is receiving top research priority. Therefore, the science is still undergoing change as we gain further insight into the many nasty tricks this pathogen carries, including interfering with the early adaptive immune response. While part of the pathology of the virus is around blood clotting and paradoxically hemorrhaging due to endothelial damage and platelet aggregation, this is just one component of its payload. The interfering of the early immune response is likely to facilitate the latter cytokine storm seen in some individuals, which can also prove lethal. This is one reason why COVID-19 vaccination might prove to also be so important in protecting against the worst forms of the disease, because it prevents the virus from delaying the early adaptive immune response through its interference with the interferon pathway, because the immune system has already been primed to respond to COVID-19 via the spike protein, which is used in the vaccine. Fourthly, we are not created equal immunologically or physiologically. The heterogeneity in the pathophysiology of COVID-19 disease is substantial, and this too leaves the door open for snake oil salesmen to cherry-pick data. Why the virus is lethal in some folk and asymptomatic in others is just another complication of this pathogen that we really don't understand yet. But certainly the one thing we can say is that classic risk analysis can be applied to any individual who is thinking of not getting the vaccine. Simply put, the key question is, what are my risks of getting an idiopathic event from the vaccine, like a DVT, versus getting a nasty version of COVID-19 that either leads to long COVID or death? Well, let's work with the UK death rate from COVID-19. At the time of making this video, there have been 4.6 million people in the UK infected with COVID-19, and out of that, 128,000 of them have died. This means the average death rate is approximately 2.78% in the UK. The number of people, according to the Centre for Disease Control in the USA, who have died soon after receiving the COVID-19 vaccine is approximately 0.0017%. Thus, if we ratio these two percentages, we find that the COVID-19 vaccine reduces your risk of death from actual COVID-19 by around 1,600 times. Obviously, this is a very rough back of the envelope calculation, and one objection an anti-vaxxer might raise is that it assumes the COVID-19 vaccine is affording 100% protection from lethal COVID. Yes, granted, we are assuming that. However, the calculation is also implicitly assuming that deaths after receiving the vaccine are all caused by the vaccine itself, which is also very unlikely. So these two simplifications are at least going to partially cancel each other out. Related to this is the widely circulated social media narrative that 6 people died in the Pfizer vaccine trial. This is true. However, what is not mentioned is that 4 of those deaths occurred in the placebo control group, while 2 occurred in the treatment arm. The harsh truth is that death will occur in any study once the sample size is great enough, because people die. Fifthly, there is a push from figures in authority to get vaccinated. The reason for this is due to the science of epidemiology that relates a pathogen's contagiousness to the level of people in a population resistant to the pathogen, preventing it from entering an exponential growth in infections. With a virus like COVID-19, the only 2 ways to get it under control is to place restrictions on normal social interactions, or else create a large number of resistant individuals in the population so that the reproduction number of the virus can't go above 1, because each infected individual does not come into contact with enough susceptible individuals due to herd immunity. Unfortunately, this reality means There is an emergent population dynamic going on here, just like the Mexican wave, and so it requires a high level of social compliance for it to work. Sadly, the only way to get such group behaviour is to have authority figures direct a group toward a certain action, and this can understandably feel a little authoritarian, especially to those who naturally distrust their government, as they do in America. Yet the key issue here is that we are not free agents in relation to how we act on any given issue. The social media warrior might type in all caps to those who receive the vaccine that they are sheepies. But if you follow the anti-vaxxer lead, you are just submitting to their narrative and their authority. The only real question to ask is on which side of the argument does the dogmatic nature of reality fall? It is best to understand what the hard data from our reality is telling us, because, as the late great physicist Richard Feynman said after the investigation into the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, no amount of PR can change reality, as nature cannot be fooled. Now at this point, someone might throw up their hands and say, well, how can we know for sure who is telling the truth if we are not privy to the actual data? Well, this is where my philosophy of science video helps. In my first video, I stated that a scientific statement must pass two tests to be considered valid. Obviously, it must correspond and explain the actual data, but it also must be logically coherent. Now, while the first test for the non-expert must be taken on trust, the second test of logical coherency can be applied even by those who do not have access to the data. It is this second test that I shall now apply to some of Yeadon's more outrageous claims that he made in his hour-and-a-half-long interview. So claim 1. The RNA vaccination is dangerous because it results in the production of the Covid-19 spike protein, which is highly toxic. Okay, so Yeadon appears to turn his ire onto the Pfizer vaccine in particular, because it is a newer technology in terms of introducing an antigen to the immune system. Yet by this logic, the problem therefore is not to do with the RNA delivery vector, but rather what the RNA produces when it is translated into protein. However, if there really was a problem in introducing the spike protein as a vaccine antigen, then this will equally apply to all vaccines, including those technologies that have been used for many decades. Yeadon says his expertise is in toxicology, but a basic rule of toxicity is that it is directly correlated to the dose of the toxin. So a relevant question is which is going to produce more spike protein? An active COVID-19 viral infection, where the virus is replicating inside your cells initially exponentially, or in a vaccine where there is a finite small dose of antigen that cannot be replicated because in the case of an adenovirus vaccine, the virus is replication deficient, and in the case of the mRNA vaccine, it has no genetic code to cause it to replicate itself inside cells. Interestingly, in preparing this video, I came across a paper by Coates et al., which offered an explanation for the incredibly rare thromboses that have been observed with both the Oxford and J&J adenovirus vaccines, but not with the mRNA vaccines. The spike protein that is produced by all the vaccines has a membrane tethering sequence to ensure that it is not expressed as a soluble protein, but rather is kept tethered to the cell membrane for detection by immune cells. The reason for this design is precisely to minimize any spike protein toxicity, which might occur if it is circulating as a soluble entity, as it does in the context of a full-blown COVID-19 viral infection. However, the AstraZeneca and J&J adenovirus delivery systems means that the spike protein is first transcribed inside the nucleus of infected cells and therefore subject to gene splicing. Unfortunately, cell biology is never simple, and in relation to nuclear DNA, genes are often split into coding regions, called exomes, with large interrupting sequences of DNA which do not code the protein. These intervening sequences are called introns. When the DNA is transcribed into messenger RNA in the nucleus, these intron sequences are removed to create a properly constructed mRNA template on which ribosomes will make the protein. Now, COVID-19 is an RNA virus that never enters the nucleus, so it is not subject to gene splicing. However, the spike protein that is made via the adenovirus system is subject to nuclear spliceome machinery, and it turns out that within the spike protein sequence there are possible recognition sequences which will cause certain bits of the spike RNA transcript to be excised before it leaves the nucleus ready for translation to protein. These splicing events are likely to remove the spike protein from its membrane tether, resulting in some of the protein product being released by the cells as a soluble entity. In very rare circumstances, this has led to thromboses. However, it is important to stress these events are incredibly rare. For example, in Europe, they had 150 thromboses after the AZ vaccine had been given to 17 million people. That means a 1 in 113,000 chance of getting an adverse reaction with the AZ vaccine. So ironically, at this stage, it appears that it is the RNA vaccine that is slightly better designed and possibly safer because it cannot produce any soluble spike protein. In terms of the adenovirus vaccines, it is relatively trivial to alter the genetic sequence slightly so that these splicing events do not occur. Thus, I expect the next generation of adenovirus COVID-19 vaccines will be even safer than the current ones, which compared to just about every other medical intervention, including taking common pharmaceuticals such as aspirin or paracetamol, are incredibly safe. Incidentally, Yeadon also raises the possibility that the COVID-19 vaccine might interfere with reproduction because it could cause antibodies to be produced against a placental protein called syncytin. He does not overly emphasize this point, so I'm not going to include this in my video as one of his claims. However, as he talks about this potential issue, he questions some data in a paper that actually shows that COVID-19 vaccines do not produce antibodies to syncytin. In the figure from the paper they show on the screen, it is clear that while there is a slight increase in assay signal in vaccinated samples, it appears to be well within a positive control range, which is also indicated on the figure. However, once again, even if we were to concede that the COVID-19 vaccine was able to produce antibodies to this placental protein, it is worth remembering that whatever the vaccine does, the real virus will do it to a much higher level. So if you're concerned about losing your reproductive abilities because of a COVID-19 vaccine, think about what large doses of actual COVID-19 spike protein will do to your reproductive system should you contract actual COVID-19. Okay, Yeadon's second claim. Clinicians are purposely withholding COVID-19 treatments that would save lives. Now, this is an incredibly serious claim because it is not an ethically neutral claim where one is arguing over just a scientific fact, which is like Yeadon's first claim, but rather has the extra dimension of imputing bad motive on scientists and health professionals. Now, as someone who has worked for more than 30 years as a scientist, both in industry and academia, while I freely accept that, as in all walks of life, you get scientists who might not operate by the highest ethical standards, this does not mean that the majority of scientists and doctors will actively choose an action that they know will result in more patient deaths. If you are tempted to believe Yeadon's claim that COVID-19 is easily treatable, consider other viruses from the corona family that cause the common cold. As the old adage goes, we still haven't cured the common cold, and the reason we haven't is because there is no simple way to remove a viral infection once it is established. Yes, of course, we do possess certain drugs that can slow viral replication, but the idea that there is some magic bullet drug that completely cures a person with COVID-19 is clearly not true. In terms of the often touted hydroxychloroquine, This has undergone several clinical trials now with COVID-19, and the overall data consensus is that hydroxychloroquine does not provide any clinical benefit in treating COVID-19 patients. This is why clinicians are not routinely using this drug when managing COVID-19 patients. So here, Yeadon is simply making a false claim. Claim 3. An electronic vaccine passport could be open to abuse. Yeadon imagines a scenario where a government could decide it wants to murder its population and so send a phone message informing people they need a COVID booster, and when they receive the booster, they are injected with a lethal agent that kills them. So firstly, one of the complicated aspects when examining someone who is making such extreme arguments is it is tempting to want to dismiss everything they say based on the more extreme positions they are adopting. One of the reasons one wants to do this is for fear that if you say that any of what they are saying is correct, others might think you also support their ridiculously extreme positions. So, while I do not support most of Yeadon's positions, in relation to electronic vaccine passports, I do have some agreement with him. I think there is an ethical problem with requiring proof of vaccination in order to partake in society, because no one should be coerced into receiving a vaccination. However, the rest of what Yeadon says here is clearly nothing short of absolutely delusional. Firstly, while there have been governments that have murdered their population, this type of behaviour is still not the norm and pretty rare in history. Also, even in unusually dark historic times, where you have monsters in charge like Stalin or Hitler, these governments do not just suddenly randomly murder their citizens for no reason. Murderous totalitarian governments target those they are going to eliminate, and obviously calling up a random selection of people from the population for a COVID-19 vaccine booster is not exactly targeting a particular group of individuals for extermination. For me, even if I was not a scientist and knew nothing about vaccination immunology, if someone made such an outrageous claim during a talk, I would be highly suspicious of any other claim they made, because clearly their mass murder hypothesis demonstrates they are not really grounded in reality at all. One final point before I close this video is also some of the statements the famous rock musician Eric Clapton has made in relation to the COVID-19 vaccine. Clapton sadly suffers from some form of peripheral neuropathy, and he states that after the first vaccine he had a terrible fever, while after the second vaccine his neuropathy became a lot worse. On balance, he understandably thinks that the vaccine was not a good idea. So firstly, it is very understandable why Clapton feels this way, and it is at least plausible that priming his immune system may have set off his peripheral neuropathy, as while the cause of these conditions is not clear, there is at least a credible hypothesis that a subset of them could be driven by immunological disorders. Yet pretty much any medical intervention that is in common use today has a small number of people that suffer serious side effects. For example, here I have a leaflet that comes with the common painkiller ibuprofen. Under heart and circulation effects, the leaflet reads ibuprofen may be associated with small increase in the risk of heart attack, high blood pressure and heart failure. In fact, in a study looking at more than 10 million people, the risk of being hospitalized with heart failure was increased by 19% when currently on ibuprofen, compared to those who were not currently taking the drug but had taken it in the past. Additionally, in relation to Clapton's neuropathy, even if it was the vaccine that caused it to get worse, the obvious question is what would have happened to his neuropathy if he had contracted COVID-19. If stimulating his immune system with a tiny part of the virus caused this negative effect, then most likely getting the virus itself would have resulted in at least an equivalent negative outcome. Yet some might say, but if he never got the virus or the vaccine, then he would be in a better place. Perhaps you're right, but the issue is no one can guarantee that he could not get the virus. especially when the pandemic was at its peak. Sadly, this is the problem we face in life. Everything we do is a gamble and involves some risk. If I cross the road, I might get run over. However, if I stay put where I am, I might get mugged. So sadly, all we can do is manage the risk by choosing actions which aim to minimize negative outcome. We can never fully guarantee that these actions themselves will make all negative outcomes impossible. Sadly, as the Christian faith would say, this is just not the way our fallen world works. Again, as I've mentioned earlier in this video, this is where a proper risk analysis calculation must be applied because our futures are also uncertain. So the best we can do is consider the various probable outcomes given a certain course of present action. Okay, so that is my thought video for this week. If you like this video, please do hit the like key, and if you want to see more of my content, then please do subscribe to my channel by hitting the subscribe button and the bell notification key below. Also, if you have somebody who is worried about the COVID-19 vaccine or who is very strongly anti-vaccinations, please do think about sharing this video with them so they can be better informed about the science that underpins vaccination technologies. Okay, but until next time, I hope your body and mind are in a good place, and bye for now.